Hey Michael, with X-Force PC, you may or may not know that AMD has come out with a new line of processors, the Ryzen 7000 series. And they've got the 7600X, the 7700X, the 7900X, and the 7950X, and I may have left one out in there. But the bottom line is on these processors is as you go up the product stack from the 7600 to the 7950, you're adding cores on. More cores. But in general, the clock speeds don't change a whole lot. They do change a little bit, but not a whole lot. And so what that means is the 7600X and the 7950X are going to perform in a very similar manner on X-Plane, Microsoft Flight Sim, or any type of gaming that you're looking at. I didn't say identically, I said very similarly. Now where the 7950X on the high end really comes into play is if you're doing some sort of professional type work, video editing, 3D modeling and rendering, things like that, that you can utilize those extra cores. So if you use your system for gaming and for work, and when I say work, I mean professional type applications, I don't mean Microsoft Office, then the AMD could be a big benefit to you because they have tend to have more cores, at least than what Intel has right now. So the chips we're comparing today are supposed to be apples to apples. They both run about $400. So we've got the i7-12700K. It's got 12 cores and 20 threads. That's made up of 8 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. And then the performance cores have hyper-threading, and so that's where you get 20 threads. 8 times 2 is 16. Plus you add 4 for the efficiency cores and you get the 20. The base frequency is 3.6 and the max turbo frequency is 5.0. Typically this chip is going to run, around 4.6 or so in gaming, something like that. Of course it can get as high as 5.0 in some cases. And then we've got the Ryzen 7700X. It has 8 cores, 16 threads. It doesn't have anything like efficiency cores. They're all considered performance cores. Its base frequency is 4.5. It'll turbo up to 5.4, but the typical speed you'll see is 5.2 to 5.3 when doing gaming and whatnot. Now, I tested these on X-Plane 11 and 12. I did a single 1080p, a triple 1080p setup, as well as I did 4K. And then at each of those resolutions, I ran the X-Plane, what I'm going to call the high settings benchmark. And the Ultra settings benchmark. X-Plane has a built-in benchmark, feature. It's a command line thing that I'm not going to get into the weeds on right now, but I use that built-in test. It doesn't necessarily pick the graphics options I would personally pick, but I wanted to go with the built-in test because it's sort of a standardization, and also it runs through a predefined flight, and at the end of that flight it tells you what the average frame rate was for that entire flight, rather than me just having to look at the frame rate indicator and write down what I'm seeing at any given time. So it actually calculates that over the period of about a 2 or 3 minute flight, predetermined flight. So what I'll do is I'll put those graphs up here. So what you'll see is in one color you'll see the Intel, another color you'll see the Ryzen, and you'll see the Ryzen overall performed a little bit better than the Intel at every resolution. The higher the resolution we went to, the more demanding of the test, the smaller the gap became for whatever reason. I can tell you in all of these tests we had a CPU bottleneck. These were not bottlenecked ever on the graphics. I did some analysis on that in a previous video you may have seen. So yeah, it was done with the 3080 Ti. The memory was DDR5 5200, and that's pretty much all the specs. Now, as far as the average across all of the tests, that's the very far right bar graph. It was 68 if you averaged all the tests out for the Ryzen and 63 for the Intel. So Ryzen was about 10% faster, something like that. One caveat I will mention too, with the Intel, you do have the option to pick DDR4. And at this moment in time, October 15th or so of 2022, DDR5 cost about twice as much as DDR4. Whereas on the Ryzen platform, you have to buy DDR5. Now, for the purposes of this test, I did use the same DDR5 on both platforms, but we could save some money, go with the DDR4 on the Intel, but we'd probably shave off a couple of more frames per second. So that 63 average might drop down to 60 on DDR4. It's not a tremendous difference. Once we see DDR5 start to get up into the 62, 6400 range, and I know you can buy that now, but it's crazy expensive. But once that becomes the norm, then you'll start to see a bigger difference in performance between DDR4 and DDR5. But right now, anything over about 5200 to 5600 starts to get exponentially expensive. It's already twice as much. You get into 62 to 6400, it can be 3 times as expensive for that speed RAM, and that'll change over time. So anyway, if you're considering a Ryzen 7000 system, obviously, you know, it can get the job done clearly. I saw similar results in Flight Sim 2020. I did test that as well. Not quite as big of a difference, maybe just a slightly smaller difference. I may do a separate video on that. We are not, at this moment of October 15th or 16th of 2022, offering the Ryzen 7000. I want it to mature just a little bit more. It's not quite mature enough for me. I want the BIOS, you know, the manufacturers to come out with a few more BIOS revisions and things like that. Make sure the memory compatibility is good and the stability is good and the temperature thing is all worked out. So we'll offer it soon, but we're just not quite there yet. We will get there. So hopefully that helps you understand the performance of X-Plane 11 and 12 on the new Ryzen 7000 stuff. And we'll, by the way, the Intel 13th Gen, 13900, 13700, horrible model numbers, but that's coming out, you know, in a bit, and we'll also look at that. That'll probably slightly leapfrog the Ryzen 7000 as a guess. That's a guess. But the Ryzen's currently maybe 8% faster on X-Plane than the Intel, and I have a feeling that the Intel is probably going to be like maybe a 15% increase, so it may jump over the Ryzen just a little bit, but that remains to be seen.